consequences. So chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel are a turning point in David's reign, the big turning point in David's reign. Up to this point, he's been a pretty good king and a pretty good guy. He's faced some tough decisions, but he's always acted justly, righteously. And even when times were tough and he didn't have a lot of good choices. And he's not been a perfect guy, but he's been pretty good. And now he is king. He has established his capital in Jerusalem. He's brought the Ark of God into Jerusalem. And most recently, God has promised David a dynasty. And David has dealt the Philistines, Saul's mortal enemies, a final blow. But now we've come to, after the story of David and Goliath, probably the most well-known story about David, the story of David and Bathsheba. So the story of David and Bathsheba in chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel are made up of 4 interactions that are framed between David and another character, that are framed by a war with the Ammonites. So chapter 11 begins in the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle. David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. So right off the bat, you've heard that this is the time when kings go off to war. But David, the king of Israel, stayed in Jerusalem. He sent Joab in charge of the troops instead. So the next 2 Sundays are going to focus on this story. So I'm going to go over really quickly the parts that are in the lectionary and we'll talk about on Sunday. But I'll focus on the parts of these 2 chapters that are not in the lectionary. So David stays home from the battle. One day he's napping in the afternoon. He gets up and he sees Bathsheba bathing from the top of his tall palace. He can look down and see other people's roofs, that's where people bathe. So he asks about her and learns that she's the wife of Uriah, one of his soldiers who's away at war. And he summons her and has sex with her. And then she goes home, she finds that she's conceived, and she tells him that she's pregnant. And then David summons her husband back to Jerusalem, asks him some really general questions, and gives Uriah the opportunity to go sleep with Bathsheba, which would cover up David's sin. But Uriah is a good soldier, and he refuses to go be with his wife in his home while his comrades are out fighting a battle. So instead, David wrote a letter to Joab. This is verse 14. David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and killed and die." So David arranges for Uriah to be killed in battle, just like Saul did to David, except that it never worked for Saul. So as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. So Joab follows David's orders. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then, if the king's anger rises, and he says to you, 'Why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebes? Why did you go so near the wall?' Then you shall say, 'Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too.'" So Joab has made a tactical error. He goes too close to the city wall, and a bunch of people die. He's made a tactical error. But David doesn't care because Uriah is dead too. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of your king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." David said to the messenger, "Just thus you shall say to Joab, 'Do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it,' and encourage him." So David, instead of being at the front with his troops, is having sex with the wives of his soldiers, arranges to have his soldier killed, and that throws off his commander, and a whole bunch of soldiers die. And then, so that's the second scene. And the third scene is where David is rebuked by Nathan. And David eventually admits, Nathan gets David to admit, I have sinned against the Lord. And then Nathan says to David, "Now the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die." Then Nathan went back to his house. So there will be consequences. The first consequence is the human consequence, the loss of the battle, because David wasn't there. And there actually, I should have started reading earlier. Nathan also says to David, "Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." And Nathan also says, Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. So there will be consequences for David's family. So now the fourth scene. Then Nathan went to his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became very ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child. David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him, but he would not, urging him to rise from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the seventh day the child died, and the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, "While the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we tell him the child is dead? He may do himself some harm." But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, he perceived that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" They said, "He is dead." Then David rose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servants said to him, "What is this thing that you have done? You have fasted and wept for the child while it was alive. But when the child died, you rose and ate food." He said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, 'Who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me, and the child may live.' But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." So this is a whole different side of David than we've seen before. Previously, David would ask questions and then act for himself and for Israel. For instance, David's first words in the whole saga are as he comes to the battlefield where Goliath is challenging the Israelites to send a champion up to battle him. David's first words are, What's the reward for beating this guy? And similarly with Bathsheba, he says, who is that woman? And then he acts and takes her. And even when he laments Saul and Jonathan and also Abner, it's a public lament for the king and his son and the commander of Israel. And the lament for Jonathan is kind of, as his friend, is an addendum to that public lament, that national lament for the king. So we see here a private side of David and get a glimpse at David's relationship with God. So as Uriah had done earlier, David refuses to sleep in his own bed or to eat in his house, but he lies on the ground outside the palace, just as Uriah insisted on doing earlier. David fasts, and he repents. He's doing what he should be doing in hope that God will relent. But the second that he hears that the child is dead, that he's beyond help, David gets back to business. It's like he has this grim acceptance of the child's death. What's done is done, and one day he too will die. And so while the child is sick, David's lament for the child foreshadows the death of another son, Absalom, which is hinted at by Nathan when he talks about the sword never departing David's house. And actually the news of the battle that went poorly that Abner sends also both echoes the death of Eli's sons at the beginning of the Samuel saga, and also foreshadows that battle in which Absalom dies. So then, after that, David comforts Bathsheba, and in time she does have another son, Solomon. And it says that Solomon is loved by the Lord. And then this 4-part episode concludes with the war with the Ammonites. Then Joab summons David to the front, and David does what he should have done all along, and finishes off the Ammonites. So that is some of the consequences of David's rape of Bathsheba and murder of Uriah. But there are more to come later in 2 Samuel.